Welcome to the 38th video in the Just In Case mini-series sponsored by Quality and Equality, an OD consultancy firm based in Oxford, United Kingdom. And my name is Mayan Chung Judge, the founder of the firm. We call it Just In Case, just in case you want to be refreshed or learn something or be reminded about something, as lifelong learning is one of the key characteristics of us OD practitioner. Today, I am so delighted. Delighted is really a British understatement. I'm excited about our contributor, a good colleague of mine, Barry Johnson. And I doubt whether any one of you have not heard about polarity management. And Barry is the founder, profound thinking and creator of the Polarity Map. And he has wide range experience with the business and industry and government and education, plus not-for-profit sector around the world, helping people to think about wicked issue, not through the either or, but through the both and. And very excited that on top of his two very amazing texts on polarity management, Barry recently published two new books titled Volume 1, Foundation and Volume 2, Application, and both are essential tools for those of us who want to really learn to support organizations through these complex and wicked issues. One thing about Barry is he brings his head and his heart together in his work. It's very hard to distinguish which bit of Barry is he using when he talks about polarity management. He's passionate about the polarity framework, and he's very logical in guiding us through. And today, Barry is doing part 1 and part 2 to the Just In Case video. The next video is Barry's part 3 and part 4. And he will take us through the polarities that are and how to leverage them. And in the second part, in the polarity thinking, Barry will then unpack paradoxical change and how we can use resistance to change as a source of stability and change. And he will also guide us to think through what processes to help organization get unstuck. So thank you so much, Barry, for investing your time and energy to share your thinking with the world. And time over to you, Barry.
Thanks a lot, Mian. I appreciate very much being able to be a part of this series. I think it's a wonderful service you're providing. So this is going to be a 4-part series on polarity thinking. And the first part is about why to learn about polarities, what polarities are, and how do you leverage them. The second part is going to be about paradoxical change and using resistance to change as a resource for stability and change. And also in part 2 is the getting unstuck process. In part 3, we're going to look at the genius of or and the genius of and. And we're also going to take an opportunity to look at, is something a problem or a polarity? How do you make that distinction? And in part 4, we're going to look at how or thinking with and thinking helps us address poverty, racism, and sexism, and how or thinking with and thinking helps us address the climate crisis. So those are the 4 parts. Let's get into the first part. So part 1, why learn about polarities, what are polarities, and how do you leverage them? In terms of why learn about polarities, the first thing is to become more effective. The research is very clear. Organizations and leaders that leverage polarities well outperform those that don't. It can make you more effective as a parent, as a citizen of your community, of your country, as a leader of an organization, or as a member of a team in an organization. In a variety of ways, it can improve your effectiveness. It'll also help you address big, complex issues without being overwhelmed, because within the midst of complexity, it's often becomes more complex if we see all the variables as just independent variables. But if we can see patterns within the complexity, it can help us get a handle on it without being overwhelmed. Polarities are just such a pattern. They are patterns that exist within complexity that can help us get a handle on it. It'll also increase your attainability, speed, and sustainability of any change effort you want to make, whether this is a personal change effort or whether it's an organizational or national change effort. It can increase your attainability of that effort, the speed and sustainability of it. It'll also help you in addressing chronic conflict and polarization. When we experience polarization, especially chronic polarization, the reason it is chronic is because it's probably wrapped around a polarity. And polarities are unavoidable and indestructible, so that polarization is going to be there for as long as you or the organization you're working in exists. So it really is helpful in addressing chronic polarization. The final thing is it increases your capacity to love. One of my mentors, Jack Gibb, told me a long time ago that if we could see an individual, an organization, or a group of society or a nation state, if we could see them completely, love is just a natural result. And I believe that's true. And so when you have a polarity lens as a resource, it helps us see people more completely, helps us see our organizations more completely and our nation states and our humanity. And in this more completeness of seeing that a polarity lens helps you have, it increases your capacity to love. So these are 5 reasons why I think it'll be useful to learn more about polarities. So what are polarities? Polarities are interdependent pairs that need each other over time. They live in us and we live in them. They exist in every level of system, from inside our brains to global issues. They're energy systems that we can leverage, so we can be intentional about using the energy that they provide. They're unavoidable, they're unsolvable in that you can't choose one pole of a polarity and have a sustainable solution. They're also indestructible, and they're unstoppable. So they're a powerful social human energy system and system in nature. They're a gift of nature, a natural phenomena like gravity and sunshine. So let's get on with how they look and how we deal with them. So the first most basic example of polarities is inhaling and exhaling. Another word for polarities is an interdependent pair. So they contain 2 parts, each of which is important, and they need each other, just like inhaling needs exhaling. Notice how ridiculous it would be to connect inhaling and exhaling with the word or. If you have a polarity, you need to connect them with the word and. For example, just think how ridiculous it would be for you and me to get in a fight over whether we're going to inhale in the future or we're going to exhale in the future. It wouldn't matter who won, we'd be blue in the face very soon. So with all polarities, we need to connect them with and. So we need to both inhale and exhale. Let me go to some leadership polarities that are important. A few leadership polarities and a few organizational polarities. So effective leaders, if you think of a leader who you really respect as effective, my guess is that he, she, or they are both clear and flexible. Because if they were clear without being flexible, they would be experienced as rigid and it would undermine their leadership. But if they were flexible without being clear, it would undermine their leadership because they would be seen as too ambiguous. So what we try to do with all polarities is we want to maximize both upsides, maximize our clarity and our flexibility. That's why the infinity loop here goes high into the upside of both poles. And we want to minimize the downside. We don't want to be rigid, we want to be clear. We don't want to be ambiguous, we want to be flexible. And if we can combine clarity and flexibility, it leads to effective leadership. Another important leadership polarity is being self-assured and humble. Again, thinking about that leader that you've already have in mind. My guess is that leader is both self-assured and humble. They combine that somehow. Their own experience and intuition has led them to appreciate the contribution of each. So what we know is that if you're self-assured without being humble, you get experience as being arrogant. If you're humble without being self-assured, you're seen as spineless. So again, what we need to do is maximize both being self-assured and humble for effective leadership. And this spiral, by the way, in the picture is a part of the polarity map that we're building here. And it's a spiral representing a virtuous cycle of that energy. There's a natural tension between the poles of a polarity, but it can be leveraged in such a way that it creates a virtuous cycle of energy lifting you towards a greater purpose. In this case, the purpose is effective leadership. If we look at organizations, we have decentralized parts in order to be responsive and flexible and fluid. We also have a centralized whole in order to be coordinated. When we can combine the both, we have an effective organization. Another polarity for organizations is stability and change. We need stability to provide continuity, but we also need change in order to transform the system and be responsive to emerging issues inside and outside the organization. So the continuity and transformation leads to being an effective organization. So now I'd like to just get more deeply into how polarities work, what is their dynamic, and how our polarity map captures that dynamic. So another polarity like inhaling and exhaling that we experience daily and is a central part of our life is activity and rest. Notice, by the way, there's no place you can go to decide whether you're going to do activity and rest. It is just a part of your life. You're living in the phenomena of activity and rest as long as you're alive on the planet. So with activity and rest, if we follow these arrows, we can notice that when we get up in the morning, we take the arrow going up to the upper left here, and we can look at activity, and we go to activity in order to get the positive results from being physically and mentally active. Just think, what are some positive results that you can think of if you're, get up and you go to work or you go to play, whatever, and you're physically and mentally active? What are a couple of positive results that come to mind? Okay, a few that come to mind for me is that you get a sharp mind if you're mentally active. If you're physically active, your body is toned. And if you're engaged in a lot of things, you're stimulated and challenged. So there's all these wonderful upsides about being physically and mentally active. It's great. However, if we are active without getting any rest, if we overfocus on a sharp mind and body tone and stimulated on all the upsides of activity and neglect the benefits of rest, we're going to get these negative results from overfocusing on activity to the neglect of rest. What might that be? What would happen if you overfocused on activity to the neglect of rest? What comes up for you? Okay, well, what comes up for me is that your sharp mind becomes a mind on overload. Your toned body becomes an exhausted body. And instead of being stimulated and challenged, you end up being just burned out. So notice what's happening here. We have stayed on the activity pole. And the point is that each pole of the polarity has a huge upside, which makes it essential. But it also has a liability or a downside, which occurs when you pay attention to it to neglect of its partner. So when you experience your mind on overload, your body exhausted, or you're burned out, the natural flow, if you follow the arrow from this downside minus B here, if you follow that arrow, it takes you right up to the upside of rest. So the reason we go to the upside of rest is to get its benefits. It's the necessary benefits as a complement to activity. So what are the positive results from getting physical and mental rest? What comes to mind for you? Okay, what comes to mind for me is instead of having your mind on overload, you get integrated thoughts. Instead of body exhausted, you get a rejuvenated body. Instead of burned out, you become relaxed. So notice how the upside plus C is the natural antidote to the downside minus B in this polarity. This is true with all polarities. The natural antidote to the downside of one pole is the upside of the other pole, but it's not a solution. So rest isn't a solution to activity, as if you just choose, well, the problem with activity is that you get burned out, so we just need to have rest as a solution, because rest is not a sustainable solution. It is a natural, necessary self-correction to being burned out. However, if we overfocus on rest to the neglect of activity, we find ourselves in the downside. What would the negative results be from overfocusing on rest to the neglect of activity? What comes to mind for you? Okay. What came to mind for me is your integrated thoughts become a dull mind, your rejuvenated body gets out of shape, and your relaxation becomes boring and lack of stimulation. You become a couch potato, and it becomes a disaster. So obviously, this is the downside to rest without activity. Again, the point is that rest brings an essential dimension to this pair of activity and rest rest without activity becomes dysfunctional. And notice also that when you experience this dulled mind and out of shapeness, the natural response from that is to go outside, become active. So the self-correction for the downside of rest is the upside of activity. That's why this infinity loop throughout your life, you will be oscillating through this polarity, whether you like it or not. So this is the basics of a polarity map. We'll add to it a little bit more now by going into another dimension. And one final point before we leave this slide. It is a false choice whether you're going to choose activity or rest. It makes no sense. With all polarities, because they're interdependent, it makes no sense to connect them with or. We need to connect them with and. So, all of us are in the activity and rest polarity. So we all have it available to us, but we all can't run a marathon. So now we're getting into the full polarity map. And this gets into what happens if you want to leverage a polarity. In our process, it is important to see them. That's the first thing you need to do, is see them. But eventually, if you want to do something special with that polarity, then you need to leverage it. And this is how we would leverage it. So if you want to run a marathon, you start off from what we call, at the bottom of this map is the deeper fear that you can't run a marathon. So that's your situation at this time. But you want to move up to run a marathon. This becomes your greater purpose. You want to run a marathon, and you have activity and rest at your disposal. It's right there. You don't have to go somewhere to get it. It's right there for you. And so now we're going to do the same activity and rest process, except we're going to be more intentional about it. So my son, Tim, for example, has qualified 5 times for the Boston Marathon. In the process of getting himself in shape to qualify, first for the Detroit Marathon, you have to qualify for another marathon before the Boston Marathon. You can't go in directly. So he would qualify in Detroit and then go on to the Boston Marathon. In his process of trying to qualify for the Detroit Marathon, in terms of the upside of activity, what he's doing is he's getting the benefits of increasing his endurance. And we look to the left of it, there are action steps that we do to maximize the upside of activity in order to run a marathon. So what he's going to do on the action step side, he's going to run further most workout days, right? So it's a systematic running where he may run a few miles the first day, but over, say, a 6-month period of preparing for a marathon, he might run further each workout day, which will increase his endurance. But it only increases his endurance if he also gets the benefit of the upside of rest, which is muscles build. So muscles build actually on the rest cycle, assuming you've been active. So what would be his action step in order to make sure that he gets the upside of rest in terms of running a marathon? Well, he'll get adequate downtime between workouts. So he builds into his schedule, how frequently he's going to run, when he's going to take days off. So he gets an adequate downtime. This is all scheduled in. So with all polarities, what we're trying to do is maximize both upsides by having action steps that support both upsides. So it's a dual strategy. How do we get the upside of both? He's going to run further most workout days, and he's going to get adequate downtime. Now, the other dimension for leveraging polarities well is to be aware that there is a downside to each and build in some early indicators, some early warnings that let us know that we could be getting there so that we end up not getting that downside. So if Tim were to overfocus on activity to the neglect of rest, overfocus on running further without letting his muscles build, he'll end up getting a muscle injury. So how he can avoid that, what would an early warning be, is an early warning could be that he's feeling tired when he wakes up one morning and he realizes, oh, I didn't get as much sleep last night as I had planned. I want to do a workout. I was supposed to do 15 miles today, but I think I'm going to cut back to 10 because I just don't want to push myself and risk a muscle injury. So that's one early warning for the downside of overfocusing on activity. The downside of overfocusing on rest is muscle atrophy. You just don't build your muscles because you're laid up. What would be an early warning that you're headed towards muscle atrophy? It could be as simple as you missed a workout day. Now, if you're in a 6-month regimen, it doesn't matter if you've missed a workout day. You can miss that workout day, but it is an early warning to let you know you can't continue to miss workout days or you're going to get in trouble. So this is how all polarities work. You want to maximize the upsides by using action steps to do it, and you want to minimize your downsides by paying attention to early warnings so that you can do what you want to do, which is to run a marathon. Now, a couple of other dimensions about how all polarities work that are important with Tim's marathon preparation as an example. If you overfocus on one pole to the neglect of the other, first you get the downside of the pole on which you overfocus. So Tim, on one occasion, between the Detroit Marathon and the Boston Marathon, he decided he really wanted to reduce his time. He'd already qualified, but he wanted to just reduce his time for the marathon. He overfocused on his working out and increasing his endurance, and he neglected adequate downtime. And he ended up with shin splints. So he had a muscle injury. Now notice, first he gets the muscle injury, but then since he's got that muscle injury of shin splints, he now is laid up so that he has muscle atrophy because he can't work out at all. He also missed the Boston Marathon. So with all polarities, what's important to realize is that if you overfocus on one pole or the other to neglect of its partner, first you get the downside of the pole on which you overfocus, then you get the downside of the other pole as well. So the objective, if you want to run a marathon, is maximize both upsides and minimize the downsides. That's why the infinity arrow looks the way it does in the map. That's a well-leveraged polarity. Okay, how do you leverage polarities then? Just as a quick summary here, it's a 5-step process that we have for leveraging all polarities. The first is seeing. You need to see that it's a polarity. The second, you need to map it to appreciate what are all the elements in the map. What are the upsides and downsides? What's the greater purpose and deeper fear? Once you have that, you can assess it and you can learn from your assessment, and then you can get into leveraging. So this is what it looks like. So you can do all 5 of them. You can see, if you look at the stack to the right here, you can see the polarity. Then the next box is a polarity map. You can map it. The next one has the polarity map with the arrows. The question is, how well are we doing at getting both upsides and minimizing the downsides? And then the last 2 are action steps and early warnings, which is the leveraging process. Now, how do we leverage it? And every step of the way, we want to engage key stakeholders. They can help us identify which polarities are important. They can help us map it, assess it, learn from it, and then they can help us think of action steps and early warnings. So engaging key stakeholders is really important when you're involved in a change effort and wanting to leverage polarities of any kind. So let me share a story with you about how this was done. I met David Wennergren when he was the Chief Information Officer for the United States Navy. And I had been leading courses at the Naval Postgraduate School for executive naval officers in Monterey, California. And one of the times when I was leading that day with these trainees, Dave Wennergren came in a day earlier than me because he was going to talk with the group. And I arrived early so that I could meet him. And I came into the room and heard his presentation, which was great. And then he and I went out to eat at a restaurant with the senior naval officers that were in the workshop. And so he and I were sitting at a table with 4 other naval officers, and they started asking me politely. I had been introduced when I walked into the room. I was introduced as the guy who was doing the polarity stuff the next day. And so at the table, one of the officers asked me right at the beginning of the meal, so Dr. Johnson, what is this polarity stuff that you're going to be sharing with us tomorrow? And I shared a brief description of polarities, and that led to a question, which led to another question. And so the whole meal ended up being them asking me questions and me between bites responding to them. And it was a great time, and they had a lot of questions. And at the end, David Wennergren, by the way, didn't say anything during this whole conversation. He was just watching them and listening to them ask me questions and hearing my response. When the meal was over, he took me aside and he said, "Barry, this is just terrific stuff. I'm very disappointed. I'm not going to be able to attend your workshop tomorrow, but would it be okay if you got a card, because I'd like to call you?" And I said, "That'd be great." So a couple of months later, this is the only introduction that he had, was just a dinner meal with the senior naval officers asking me questions and me responding. So we had, we were there for maybe an hour and a half or something. So he had that much introduction. But in the meantime, when he called me up from the Pentagon about 2 months later, in the interim, he had been promoted to become the Deputy Chief Information Officer for the whole Department of Defense. And he called me from the Pentagon and he said, "Barry, I've got this new job, and as I'm moving through the Pentagon and just listening to people as a part of my new job, just trying to be a good listener, I have found 2 groups that are really fighting with each other, and they're just really stuck, and it's a real problem." And he said, "We have one group that is saying we need to do a good job at information sharing. If we don't do a good job at information sharing, we're going to have another 9/11 where planes are going to fly into our trade center or other kind of attacks on our country, and we won't respond. We were vulnerable because we didn't do a good enough job of information sharing. So we need to pick up on that." There's another group that's saying we need to do a good job of information security. If we don't do a good job of information security, our enemies are going to get access to our information we don't want them to have. They're also likely to mess with our information, disrupt our information. So we need to have information security. And over the phone, he said to me, "Barry, these 2 groups are trying to serve and protect our country from the other group." And he said, "Is this possibly one of those polarity things you were talking about at dinner?" And I said, "I think so, sir." And he said, "Well, will you and Barry Frew, would you mind coming to the Pentagon and meet with me and my senior team? Because we are not serving and protecting by our fighting over this issue. And I think we need to get a handle on it." So Barry Frew, who was the guy who ran the course at the graduate school in Monterey, a retired naval officer, he and I went to the Pentagon, and we met with, there were about 12 people on his executive team at the Pentagon. And we had a blank polarity map up on the screen. And we had a staff member who was entering the content. They had it on their computer, and the computer screen was projected. The computer screen was projected on a big screen on one side of the room, and it was everything was blank except the 2 poll names: information sharing and information security. So David had seen this as a possible polarity. We put those 2 polls there, and then what I did with them is I just identified the content for the 4 quadrants in the following series. By the way, the contents contain much more than this. This is just some sample content as to what we generated. The other thing to note is that I didn't have any investment in the content of the map. When you build a polarity map with other key stakeholders, the wisdom is in them. The map becomes a wisdom organizer. So David had said information sharing and information security was important, and there was a tension around it. And the senior executive team agreed there was this tension. So we already had agreement that was important. So then I asked them, if we look at in the upper left quadrant, where we talk about plus A, we're looking for the values that are associated with that upper quadrant. So I asked them the question, if we did a good job of information sharing at the Department of Defense, what would be some positive results? And they came up with innovation, creativity, agility, increased national security awareness, and a number of other things. I then asked them, well, what would be positive results if we did a good job of information security? And they came up with, well, we would be better protected. We'd reduce loss. We would make it more costly for the attacker, and we would increase national security protection. Then I went to the lower left, minus B, fears, and I said, well, what would happen if you over-focused on information sharing to the neglect of information security? And I pointed out to them that what you would get is the opposite of what's in plus C in the upper right. You would lose those things if you neglected them in favor of information sharing. So instead of protected, they're vulnerable, etc. So the list they came up with for the downside of information sharing is vulnerable, identity theft, loss of competitive advantage, and information overload. Then I asked them, went to the final quadrant, the lower right quadrant, and said, what happens if you overfocus on information security to the neglect of information sharing? And they came up with stifles creativity, inflexibility, negative workforce attraction, and creating stovepipes. So then, and they had others. But once they saw the map, I said, okay, why would you want to bother to get those two upsides? I was asking the question that goes in the greater purpose at the top. And they said, we need to do this in order to have information advantage. And I said, okay, so your greater fear would be the opposite of that. How would you identify that greater fear? And at the bottom, they had irrelevance and insecurity. So it was clear, okay, this is information sharing and security. We want to leverage it well in order to create information advantage and to remove vulnerability and irrelevance and insecurity. So the next step, now we've done two steps. We've done the seeing and the mapping. Now we're going to assess it. So I did a quick verbal assessment with them, but our assessment, which we have, by the way, you can take with your whole organization can take it. You can anything that can get on the internet, you can take our assessment and share the results with each other. But in this case, I just did a verbal assessment with them. I pointed out this. I said, look, we need to assess how well we're doing in all four quadrants. So if we were doing really well, this infinity loop reflects a well-leveraged polarity. Notice the loop goes way high in the top, and it indicates that we are almost always in both upsides, which is what we want. And if you look down in the two lower quadrants, we're almost never in either lower quadrant. So this would be we're really maximizing the benefits of both upsides, and we're minimizing the downsides of each. So that would be optimal. But I said to them, if you got in a power struggle between information sharing and information security, and information security won, your assessment would look more like this. You'd be caught in the downside of information security. If you had a power struggle and information sharing won, it would look like this. So I said, do either of these fit for you or some combination? What would you say your assessment looks like? And they told me the assessment looks like this. So we all sort of laughed and said, well, that's obviously a disaster and we're getting both downsides. And so we then proceeded to say, okay, so what are we going to do about this? And the first thing we did was we looked at action steps for each upside. The question with action steps I would ask them is, what are you doing or could you be doing to maximize the upsides of information sharing in this upper left for action steps for A? So they talked about marketing, understand imperative to share in their training. They look at how, why to share, and they would integrate security solutions into sharing activities. So those are three of a long list they came up with. Then I said, well, what can you do to get the upsides, make sure you gain and maintain the upsides of information security? And three things they came up with is under marketing is understanding the value of security, and training, practicing good security and hygiene, and three, providing good security tools. So those would be action steps they could take. Notice how they started thinking in parallel terms, by the way. So on the left, the upper left, the first number one is marketing, understand the imperative to share. Well, what would be the parallel to support information security around marketing? And that would be understanding the value of security. And in training, on the left side, Training for information sharing would be training how and why to share. Training for security would be training on practicing good security hygiene. So they just looked at dimensions in which they could make sure that they were intentionally getting the upside of both poles. Then we looked at the early warnings for both downsides. And I asked them the question, how would you know early, on the lower left, for example, early warnings for minus B, how would you know early that you have been over-focusing on information sharing to the neglect of information security? In other words, the areas that are in the lower quadrant, the lower left quadrant of information sharing, being vulnerable, identity theft, loss of competitive advantage, and information overload, how would you know that would happen in a way that's measurable? The early warnings need to be early and measurable. So they have, for example, two of them were loss of personally identified information. That loss would be increasing. So there's an increase in personally identifiable information loss. Also, there's an increase in successful intrusion and data exfiltrations. Those are going to go up. So if either of those, which we can measure, if those are going up, we need to pay attention to that, and we need to probably focus on additional things we can do as action steps for the upper right beyond what we already have there, because we're getting those vulnerabilities. Then we focused on the early warnings for D, the downside of information security. How would we know early that we've been stifling creativity, we've got inflexibility, and that we're creating stovepipes? A couple of early warnings are information in newly fused systems are not visible or accessible outside the enclave. Second, so there's a lack of visibility. Second one is the time to get required information up. There's an increase in the time to get information up. That indicates we're in a downside. So we ended up having this whole set, and that was the process. It took less than a day to map it all out, come up with all the action steps, and Dave Wennergren brought this presentation, their map with all the action steps and early warnings, to various parts of the Pentagon and said, look, we have a tension here between information sharing and information security. What we need is, and his quote was, we need secure sharing. We need to do both of these things. So we need to connect them with and he shared the results. And in some cases, they added things they could do, in particular in their section of the Department of Defense. So here are a set of questions. That's the end of this first section. And here are some questions that you might think about answering for yourself, just to make sure you have incorporated what has shown up in part one. Why learn about polarities? What are polarities? What are the parts of a polarity map? What is the normal flow in the infinity loop within the quadrants? What happens first and second if you overfocus on one pole? To move toward the greater purpose, what needs to be done with both upsides? How do you do that? What needs to be done with both downsides? How do you do that? What are the 5 steps in the small process? So hopefully these are questions that you can answer and that you'll find this useful in your effort to make a difference. So in part 2, we're going to look at paradoxical change, using resistance to change as a resource for stability and change. And the other thing we're going to do is look at getting unstuck. So let's start with paradoxical change and how to use resistance to change as a resource for stability and change. This is chapter 5 in the book. And I want to share a story with you about a Fortune 100 company that's based in the United States. And it's located in 46 countries around the world. And the situation is that I'm on a phone call with 3 people. And in this phone call, it's a planning phone call. The 3 people on the line is the Chief Operating Officer, the Chief Information Officer, and the head of the design team that is preparing a 4-day leadership gathering for people from all 46 countries. It's about the top 250 people from around the world are coming for this leadership gathering, and they have a half a day dedicated to polarity thinking. And so they're talking with me about that 4-day gathering, and who else is coming as resources. And we're just trying to make sure that my presentation will fit in with the rest of the schedule. And so on the phone call, one of the first things that they say to me is, we'd like you to understand what the theme is. And they said, the theme is leading through values. And my response is, well, that's just terrific, because values, from a polarity perspective, values can be seen as the upside of both poles of the polarity, or as the two poles. And so we can be looking at values pairs, we can looking at leadership and polarity thinking, and they'll work really well together. And the chief operating officer said back, he said, wait a minute, are you saying that values come in pairs? And I said, yes, sir, I think so. So when I'm working with organizations, if they're creating their values as a part of a startup, I encourage them to just look at their values in pairs, this value and this value. If they already have a list of values, what I do is I join them in looking at the list, and we look to see if there's one value on the list that actually its pole partner is another value on the list. For example, if they had activity as a value, we'd be looking in the list for rest. Not because we've got anything against activity, but we know that activity without rest will be a problem. So that's what I do. And if they have a value and its partner doesn't show up on the list, then I encourage them to identify something that would work. So I just explained this to them. And the chief operating officer said, wait a minute. If you're going to be messing with our values in front of our top 250 people, I want to know what you would do with them. And he said, I'm sending you our values right now. And so he sent me the values, and one of the values that showed up was autonomous business units. Now, if you're located in 46 countries, you're a global organization, it makes sense that one of the things you would value is some autonomy for your business units. So that was great. And if you look at the top of this map, I was thinking in terms of a polarity map now. And so he had one pole, and and I was wanting to give them a competitive advantage by leveraging their values, one of which we already had, rather than the deeper fear at the bottom is that they can't compete. So it would undermine their ability to compete if they didn't identify another value to autonomous business units and somehow leverage it. So that's my mental framework. I've got this blank map in my mind. And so they have autonomous business units as a value, and I'm looking at their list of values. It's a very short list. I think there were maybe 6 of them. And I was looking for something that would be a value partner to autonomous business units. So I'd like you to think for just a couple of seconds, what would you be looking for if you were on the phone with these 3 people, this huge organization, they had autonomous business units? What would you look for as a value? What kind of parallel would you need to have to make sure that autonomous business units didn't become problematic? Okay, so whatever you came up with, I'm assuming it's something like integrated business units or centralized coordination or system integration to keep the autonomous business units from becoming dysfunctional. Well, they didn't have anything like centralized coordination or some of the things you might have come up with. Nothing in that area around integration of these autonomous business units. So I pointed that out. I said, you don't have anything that looks like, coordination or support of coordination integration. It was obvious it wasn't, because there was nothing like it on the list. So he said to me, well, what do you make of that? And I said, well, now from a polarity perspective, what I know is since they have autonomous business units in their values and they don't have anything like centralized coordination or integrated business units, they're likely to overfocus on that pole of the polarity. So what they're going to get is some negative results from overfocusing autonomous business units to the neglect of integrated business units because it's just not up and visible. What might those negative results be? What might they be experiencing if they overfocused on autonomous business units to the neglect of integrated business units? What comes to mind? Okay, so here are a couple of things. I had a longer list, but I'm just going to share a couple of things that came to mind for me. So I said to them, your organization is experiencing or will experience the following dysfunctions. You're going to have silos. You're going to have isolation of among the business units from each other, and you're going to have excess competition, you're going to have redundancies, etc. So I read off this list. My guess is your list looks something like that. What I said to them next is, I said, at some point, you're going to identify this set of downsides of autonomous business units without integrated business units. You're going to identify that as a problem. And what you're going to do is you're going to bring together your business unit heads and your executive team, and you're going to identify, how do we solve this problem? Now, from a polarity perspective, we know the antidote to the downside of autonomous business units is the upside of integrated business units. So we were looking for the positive results from doing a good job of integrating your business units. What would those be? What would be the antidote to silos and excess competition? What comes to mind? Okay, so what I shared with them is you need to move from silos. You're going to agree that you need to go from silos to integration of the business units and from competition to collaboration. You need to make that move. I said, so you're going to all agree that you're going to do this, and then you're not going to go there. And there was silence on the end of the phone. And the chief operating officer, I said, after a little bit of silence, a few seconds, I said, hello? And the chief operating officer came back with a really stern voice. He said, who have you been talking to? And I said, I haven't been talking with anybody. This is just, I know how polarities work and how values work. And so this was actually pretty predictable that you'd have trouble going there. And he said, wait a minute. He said, I understand how from our autonomous business units that we could be vulnerable to silos and competition. I also understand how we would want to go for a solution to have integration of those units and support collaboration. But did I hear you correctly in you saying we weren't going to walk our talk? I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, I want to know how you knew that, because 2 years ago, I held that very meeting that you talked about. And we agreed to the person, all the business unit heads and everybody on the executive team, that was the problem with us and that was the solution and we needed to go there. And we have hardly moved an inch in 2 years. It's costing us millions of dollars. I want to know how you knew that we weren't going to walk our talk. We had the money, we had the dedication, everybody was lined up. Leadership supported it, union supported it, everybody supported it. And I said to them, well, that's why I'm coming to spend a half a day with you at your workshop. And why don't we deal with this very polarity at the workshop? And so they agreed to do it. So when we got to the workshop, we had 250 people all sitting in groups of 6, sitting around tables, working with this polarity map. And they ended up filling out this polarity map, including action steps and early warnings. So that's what they did, and it helped them significantly. But let's pay attention now to how would I know that they weren't going to walk their talk? And that is because the resistance to this obvious solution is something that they're holding on to and something they're afraid of. And this is why a polarity map is so useful, is that if you're moving from autonomous business units to integrated business units, you need to recognize, what are you going to hold on to that caused you to put autonomous business units in your value system in the first place? What is the baby you want to hold on to when you're throwing out the bathwater? And that question shows up in a polarity map. You're just asking, what would be the positive results from doing a good job of allowing autonomy for your business units? What are those values? So you think about that just for a couple of seconds. What would be the positive results if you did a good job of allowing autonomy in your business units, especially if they're located in 46 countries? What comes to mind? Okay. So a couple of things that came to mind for me was entrepreneurial initiative and speed and responsiveness. You're going to have those business units are going to be entrepreneurial. What we're doing in France is different than what we're doing in Brazil or in Italy or in India. Or in South Africa. So we want to have that entrepreneurial initiative that responds with speed and responsiveness to the local situation. We value that a lot. And that's why we have autonomy autonomous business units is one of our values because we just love that. Now, the more as a culture this organization loved this entrepreneurial initiative and speed and responsiveness, if they love that at 99 on a 100 scale on the passion indicator, they would be afraid of losing it at 99 on a 100 scale. So they would be afraid that they would find themselves in the downside of integrated business units without the benefits of autonomous business units. So what would the negative results be from over-focusing on integrated business units to the neglect of autonomous business units? What would they be afraid of? Now, this is not just individually, but as a whole culture. What would their fear look like? A couple of seconds here. They're going to lose entrepreneurial initiative. They're going to lose speed and responsiveness. What are they worried about? They're worried about bureaucracy and red tape and being slow and unresponsive. Now, this indicates the whole polarity. What keeps us from moving from one pole to another is our fear of the downside of the pole we're moving towards. And the fear is that we're going to lose the upside of the pole we're moving towards. So what we need to do with all polarities is we need to, first of all, make sure that we're doing a good job of holding on to, but through the action steps on the upper left, that we hold on to what we think is important there. Then we go to action steps to look at what are we going to go after as a solution, and how do we do both of those things? How do we hold on to the best of the past and present, and how do we then, and with our autonomous business units, and then how do we look at how to enhance our function at integration and collaboration? Because we can do both, we have to do both. And then we pay attention to what would be early warnings that we're getting into bureaucracy or being too slow and responsive. What would be early warnings that we're becoming silos and have excess competition? That, once they had that, they moved much more quickly into doing both of these, and it was saving them millions of dollars as they applied that throughout their system. And it gave them the competitive advantage, the greater purpose in the first place. So some key points. If a change you're trying to make is essentially a move from the downside of one pole of a polarity as the problem to the upside of its interdependent pole as the solution, you'll generate unnecessary resistance, and the results of the struggle will be unsustainable. So it's not a problem with a solution. It is a downside, and the antidote is the other upside. But in fact, it's a segment of an ongoing infinity loop that needs all four quadrants. To make sustainable progress, key stakeholders will need to see the underlying polarity and commit to action steps supporting both upsides. So you need to involve stakeholders in identifying this map so they can join you in leveraging it well. And finally, you need to start with action steps for the pole you're moving from, then the action steps for the pole your change effort is moving to. So that's what's paradoxical about it. If you want to change the bathwater, paradoxically, make sure you got a good hold on the baby, then you can change the bathwater. So if you want to move from autonomous business units to supplement it with integrated business units, first make sure you're guaranteeing that the love of autonomous business units is going to be supported, that you're going to hold on to autonomous business units in the following ways. Then we look at how we go to integrated business units. So let's recap that in terms of polarities, the polarity of stability and change, and resistance to change, and getting unstuck. So with all polarities, there's 2 points of view. So I'd like you to imagine now, this is for any change effort. We just had one example in particular, but in any change effort, you're going to have groups of people that I'm going to embody withstand the stable. This could be the whole organization. It could be, a part of the team, whatever. But there are those people who are really want to hold on to stability. And then we've got another group that wants to bring about the change. We're going to have Cheryl, the change agent here. So Cheryl, the change agent, is talking to Stan, the stable. And what happens is Cheryl says to Stan, Stan, we've got stagnation, we've got loss of energy, we've got missed opportunities, and that's a real problem. And what we need to do is we need to go after new energy and creativity and tap new wisdom. That would be the solution. And I've got just the strategy to go there. So she's got everything she needs. She's got a problem, she's got a solution, she's got the strategy. So she shares this with Stan, and Stan says, I'm not sure I want to go there. Stan starts resisting her. And And so what Cheryl thinks, and what most change agents think when they experience resistance to their change effort, they think their change effort has been adequately supported when they use gap analysis. When they've identified the problem, they've identified the solution, and they've identified the strategy. And when they experience resistance, what they do is they repeat those three things. They say, Stan, maybe you're not clear about how terrible things are, how big the problem is. Or two, maybe you're not clear about how great the solution would be. Or three, maybe you're just confused about the strategy of how to get from there to here. Let me repeat the strategy. Now, by the way, confusion is a form of resistance. So often people will share their resistance by just saying, I'm confused. And so we repeat it as if it's all about just repeating it. However, if Cheryl repeats this problem, this solution, and this strategy, repeats that gap analysis, Stan's resistance, rather than going down because she's repeating it, goes up. And the reason his resistance will go up is because he has a different point of view. He's seeing an entirely different reality. His looks like this. He's seeing a problem is where Cheryl wants to go. He's seeing the downside of the change that she is projecting, which we're going to lose continuity, we're going to lose core values, and we're going to take foolish risks. That's his problem, the way he sees it. And he says what we need continuity and core values. We need to tap the past and present wisdom, and that's the solution. So he's got his own strategy, which is to resist the move and to get in the way of it happening. So this resistance that is coming from Stan the stable to Cheryl the change agent is coming because he has his own gap analysis. And his notion is, in the future, I see a future problem and I see a present solution, and my strategy is to hold on to the present. So this results in this ongoing tension between them, and it doesn't matter who wins because you're going to get the downside of one pole in the future. So what we need to do is we need to leverage this polarity by getting both upsides. And for that, we need to have a polarity lens to appreciate, and we need to get both upsides and both downsides. So let me talk about this process of how we get hooked and unstuck, and the getting unstuck process. So if we look at the arrow going over that bridge from the lower right losing to holding on in the upper left, the way we get hooked is by our wanting to hold on to something that we value, the plus A values. The way we get hooked is we want to hold on to something and we're afraid of losing it. And in that energy of holding on, we find ourselves in trouble. And we find out that something's missing and we're stuck in our effort to go back to the other pole. So we get stuck. Originally, we got hooked by holding on to a value, but as we hold on to that value long enough, we find ourselves in the downside and something's missing. What's missing by holding on to that value? And we get stuck when we try to go after what's missing, when we try to go to the upper right, as we just explained in the issue with the organization. So how do we get unstuck? This is what happened. So if we look at the bottom here, where it's missing, something's missing, and we're experiencing the downside of our continuity. We're discovering something is missing, and so we want to go after it. The move is from missing to the upper right. We want to transform or change, right? But if we're stuck, what we need to do paradoxically is follow the unstuck arrow, and number one, we have to first identify what are the things that those resisting are valuing. What is it they're valuing? And we need to assure them that we're going to hold on to it. Stan, what is it that you're valuing? And then we can, when we find out what they're valuing, like in the previous one, we talked about autonomous business units. We value autonomy. Okay, share more about what you value about autonomy. What are all the upsides of autonomy? Then we go follow the arrow. Step two is we ask them, if you're valuing entrepreneurship and being fast, then notice what was a wall, which you're getting stuck, becomes a bridge. If you know what they value, you can go down to number two. You know what they're afraid of losing. If they value entrepreneurship, they're going to be afraid of bureaucracy. If they're valuing Speed, they're going to be concerned about being slow and unresponsive. So we first identify what they value, then we use what was a wall as a bridge. Their point of view becomes a bridge down to their losing. Then we say, okay, you value speed, you're afraid of unresponsiveness. The question is, how can we go after some integration, the upside of this pole? It's a question we ask of Stan. How can we go after being integrated and coordinated without, now we take the arrow over to number 4, we go back to the upside without losing our speed and responsiveness in order to gain the greater purpose, to be a competitive advantage for our organization. So if I'm talking to Stan, I'm saying around the autonomous business unit and integrated business unit, it would look like this. I'm experiencing resistance from Stan going towards what I'm going after. What am I going after? I'm going after integrated business units, but I'm getting stuck. So to get unstuck, I first say, Stan, it looks like you wanting to hold on to speed and responsiveness with autonomous business units. That makes me think that you're probably afraid of bureaucracy and being slow and unresponsive. Is that true? Stan says, yep. Now notice, his point of view is being affirmed. Now what I say is, okay, Stan, what I'm wondering is, and it's as a question, is there a way for us to have integration of our business units and system-wide coordination without, that's 3, without letting go of the speed and responsiveness that you want, that's 4, in order to get our greater purpose and have an effective company. So that's what that getting unstuck process looks like. It has these 5 steps. There's a 5-step process for getting unstuck. You need to understand and respect the values of those holding on. You need to understand and respect the fears of those holding on. Then you need to ask the question, how can we gain what we're going after without letting go of the values of those holding on in order to move towards a greater purpose that works for both groups? Here are some questions for you to think about in terms of part 2. Where was the resistance coming from when the company wanted to move towards integrated business units? Why wasn't alignment, leadership support, followership support, and plenty of money enough to bring about the desired change? What is gap analysis and what are its limits when dealing with polarities? What are the steps in the getting unstuck process?
On behalf of everybody, may I say a big thank you to you, Barry, for sharing your deep insight and your wisdom to help us to really understand not only polarity, but how to support other people and the clients we work with in sorting out these very complex issues. And those of you who like to keep in touch with Barry, his email address and other resources and his biography are all at the end of the video. So do contact Barry directly. And Barry, may I say thank you again for investing your time, and for the readers and the viewers, thank you for coming to view Barry's video, and keep well, keep safe.